Hey guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another video for Simon Hurley Create. I am going to be using the new prom dress background stamp as well as the new 6x8 stamp set, Encouraging Words. So I have two pieces of the stark white cardstock, also by Simon Hurley Create. These are both cut down to an A2 size card. For this first one, I'm just taking a piece of Post-it note tape just to kind of mask off the bottom portion of my card panel. That way, once I stamp my background stamp, I'll have a nice clean edge. Also going to go ahead and add a little bit of Tombow Mono Multi Glue to the back of both of these panels, smearing that around with my finger and letting that dry for just a minute or two. That way, once it dries, it becomes repositionable, but the panel won't shift around as I'm stamping out my background stamp in my MISTI. So I went ahead and lined up my background stamp the way I wanted it on what's going to be my main card panel. And I'm going to stamp this out with some blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink. It's a waterproof ink, so you can pretty much use it for any medium that you plan on using to color these flowers. So I did stamp this a couple of times. The outline of all of these images is pretty thick, and I wanted this to be really black. I wanted to have a really crisp outline of each one of the images. So I ended up stamping this 3 times for my main panel, and I didn't bother to clean off my MISTI with all of that excess kind of hanging off there. That way, if I wanted to line up the next panel at least somewhat the same, I can kind of just use that as a guide. And again, I have the Tombow Mono Multi Glue on the back of this panel as well. This time I only stamped it twice. I seem to get a much better impression now that I have a bunch of ink on that stamp to begin with. And then we will go ahead and move on to the coloring. You can see that we have both panels here, and we're going to start off with our main panel, or the one that we used the Post-it note tape on with that crisp line, or crisp, I guess, yeah, line. So I'm going to bring out some cool gray markers, and I'm going to color pretty much all of the leaves. I'm only using a 3-color blend here. I am starting off with the C5, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base of each one of the leaves. Now, this background stamp is more of kind of like an abstract look, so it's not as intricate as some of like the realistic flowers. So not all of the lines come together. I'm just kind of pretending that they're there. And I'm also not worried about shadows, or where one image or one leaf would be hanging under another, having a shadow there. I'm pretty much just adding some shading to each individual leaf, not worried about the shadow that it would be creating on another, if that makes any sense. And I just kind of stuck with this 3-color blend, the C5, C3, and C1 for all of the different leaves. I did kind of leave these on my desk for, well, pretty much the whole time, just in case I miss a leaf or two. I could easily go back without having to try to dig through and finding those colors again. So once all of my leaves were done, we are going to color these 2 large flowers. Now I'm going to start off by taking one of the lighter colors, and I'm just going to color the edges on my main card panel. I'm not worried about what this looks like. I just want to kind of add a little bit of color to the edges of the flower, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. Now I'm going to take that other panel there, and I'm actually going to color the flower the way I want it to be colored. Now, I didn't do a great job with my coloring on this. The coloring doesn't have to be that great with this particular image. You can make it as good or as simple or as complex as you want because of that abstract look. So I'm going to go right in with my darkest color, which is the RV29, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base of each one of the petals. I did add a little bit of a shadow where one petal would be over another, just to kind of have some variation. I went ahead and blended that out with the RV25, and I am using a flicking motion here because these petals are pretty much wide open. Then I'm going to move on to the RV23, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to flick that color out even further, and then I will finish off with the RV21, and this is pretty much just for the tips of the petals. Now for this particular one, I don't even have to worry about staying in the lines because I'm going to end up fussy cutting this out anyway, but I guess it's just habit to kind of be at least a little bit careful, especially when you bring out those RV markers. So for the middle of the flower, I'm just going to bring in some YR and Y markers just to add a little bit of shading to the outside portion, and then just keeping the center of the center for the lightest. Now for this next large flower here, I'm going to basically do the same thing. I'm just going to bring in some V markers this time. But again, I'm going to take that lightest purple marker and I'm just going to color the edges of all of the petals on my main panel. Then I'm actually going to do the coloring on this other one. So again, I'm going to bring in that darkest color first and add in my shadows. Now these petals there's more of them, but they're a little bit smaller. So I am not necessarily using too many flicks here. I am a little bit in the larger areas, but pretty much I'm just outlining where the shadows would be, where one petal is laying under another. You don't necessarily need to use flicking motions every single time, or sometimes not at all. You don't have to use flicking motions ever. If you don't like that look, or if you just haven't mastered that flick, you don't need to. So next, bringing in the V06, and I'm just extending this color out a little bit. So I'm going over about halfway down where that V09 was, and I'm just making that line a little bit thicker. Again, I am adding just a little bit of flicking where the larger areas are. I'm going to do the same thing with that V04, and you can see that I'm not doing any flicking here. I'm just extending those areas out, and I'm just leaving the very tips of the petals for that V01, which is the color that we added to the tips of that other flower. So I am going to use the same colors for the center of this flower as well. I didn't do as much shading here just because this is a little bit smaller and it would pretty much just fade in with the rest of the flower anyway, but I did add a little bit of shading to the outside. Next, I'm going to bring back that main panel there, and I'm going to color in the rest of the flowers. And I'm going to start off with a yellow combination, again, starting off with that darkest color first, which is actually an orange color. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the base of these petals and where one would slightly overlap another. And then I'll bring in my Y markers and extend that out. So whenever I do shading with yellow, I'm either using an orange for my darkest color or an E marker. And in this case, I wanted it to be really bright and vibrant, so I brought in the YR. I colored all of the similar flowers with the same color combination here. And for this last one, I am going to bring in some R markers. And you can see that my darkest color is definitely a red. But then I'm going to switch over to an R22, 21, and a 00, which this will make it a little bit more pink. And again, just using that red as my very darkest color. Keep in mind, you can always go back. I wasn't happy with the blend I was getting here because I felt like it was a little bit too red and I didn't want red. And so I went back in with that R22 and 21 just to kind of flick that out a little bit more, or try to blend that out a little bit more so it wasn't so red and more pink. So next I'm bringing in a BG99, and I am going to fill in all of these little gaps around these flowers and leaves. Now you want to somewhat be careful so you're not going over the darkest areas, especially with the pinks and the purples, because you can tends to grab that color and drag it out to places you don't want it to be. But the gray areas and things like that, to be honest, I wasn't overly careful. If I went over it, I went over it. This is a fairly light color anyway, and you weren't going to see it. So once all of that was filled in, now we can go ahead and assemble the card. So now that we have the two panels complete, I am going to go ahead and fussy cut the images or the flowers that we actually fully colored. So normally you can leave a white outline, and you can certainly do that if you choose, because we have kind of a whimsical look that all of these lines don't connect. But in this case, I'm going to cut right along the black outline of each of these images. I like to cut my paper down so that it's just a little bit larger than the image. To me, it's a little bit easier to fussy cut and kind of get those intricate areas when you don't have too much excess paper to work with. And I'm going to do the same thing with the purple as well. And here I have a little bit a little visitor here, and so he made this a little bit difficult. But once I got him to go play with a pen or whatever else he was playing with, and my fussy cutting was done, I am going to take a Copic Safe pen, and this is a Stampin' Up pen. I don't know where it came from. I don't have any Stampin' Up stuff, but somehow this appeared in my craft room, and this is what I use. It's not actually black, it's a really dark gray, but I just go along the edges of the cut out image, I guess you could say, and I like to go from the back. That way if my pen slips, I'm going to scribble on the back of the flower and not the front and ruin my coloring. So next, now that that was done, I am going to go ahead and pop these up directly over my background, so I have a little bit of dimension. So I'm going to cut some Scotch foam tape here, and you can use fun foam, you can use anything you have in your stash, and you're going to line this up directly over the other images. You want to make sure that the black outline for both of the images match up the best that you can possibly get it, and it's pretty easy to line up. These are pretty simple images. And that way, because we colored the tips of the petals for the main panel there, if you kind of shift this around or turn this, you're not going to see just plain white underneath it. You're still going to see that pink or the purple underneath each one of those flowers. Now, I wanted to create a border between the white part of my panel and the colored part, so I'm going to bring out my T-square ruler and the chisel tip of my black Copic marker, and I'm just going to go ahead and draw a thick black line to kind of separate these two sections of the card. Next, for the sentiment, I'm going to treat a piece of black cardstock with an anti-static tool, and I'm taking one of the sentiments from the Encouraging Words sentiment stamp set and stamping that out with some Versamark clear sticky ink, sprinkling on some white embossing powder, and then I will go ahead and heat set that, making sure that my heat gun is heated up for at least about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper, and that will minimize the amount of warping. Now, I didn't cover the entire thing with my white embossing powder. You can see the little tip of that Y, the first Y, isn't really complete. So I just went ahead with a white gel pen and fixed that, and nobody will know the difference. So I went ahead and trimmed this down into basically just a square, or actually a rectangle, and just getting pretty close to the words themselves. And then I can kind of figure out how big that square or that rectangle is, and then cut another one, or two more actually, one from white cardstock and one from black cardstock. The white is just slightly larger than the sentiment box, and then the black will be just slightly larger than the white piece. That way they'll layer nicely, and I'll have a black border and a white border around my sentiment. So once that's done, I'm also going to go ahead and trim down my panel itself. I love to layer my panels onto a piece of black cardstock before I adhere it to my card base. I feel like this really makes everything pop off the page. So I am going to trim this down, and I do have a little bit of dimension here, so you want to make sure that your paper trimmer is nice and sturdy and nice and sharp in order to cut through that foam tape. But I just basically took 1/4 of an inch off random areas so that I still had enough of these flowers showing. And then I'm going to take a piece of black cardstock and cut that just a little bit larger than my card panel, but just a little bit smaller than my card base itself. I'm going to go ahead and adhere everything down with some Tombow Mono multi-glue. First my panel to that black piece of cardstock, then onto my card base, and then all of my layers for my sentiment will go together. And I'm going to kind of just tuck that underneath that pink flower there, so a little bit is underneath it. And once I have that in place, I can kind of just lift up the corners and add a little bit of my wet glue, and this dries pretty quickly, so I'm able to still position that and have a couple of seconds to work with that and get it to the place I need it to be. I finished off the card with a little bit of sparkle with a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just over the two main flowers, and that is it. That is the card for today, guys. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.